before we switch to our discussion, as outlined in the program and our agenda, I would like to say a few words on how this idea germinated and what issues we'll be discussing today. Of course, we're talking about the history of the Holocaust, the tendencies of Holocaust historiography, with significant scholars who are participating in our discussion this evening. And the idea of this forum arose as we were preparing the concept of the next issue of the international intellectual periodical Ukraina Moderna, which was dedicated to the history of the Holocaust in the territories of Ukraine. The title of this special issue is "How is the history of the Holocaust not written?" It is forthcoming in 2022, and it is one of the components of this special issue will be a forum that will include a discussion around a number of issues on contemporary historiographical trends, both in Ukrainian historiography of the Holocaust and in the international historiography. The trends that we're seeing in the study of the disaster of the European Jewry. The number of questions we propose to look at today will also be presented. These questions will also be presented in this issue of Ukraina Moderna. So this is a preview, if you will, a preview of these questions and this discussion with leading scholars who we hope will also join our discussion in the periodical. Now, switching to the questions that we intend to discuss today. Firstly, the academic milieu today is avidly discussing the question of responsibility and the participation of local organizations and society in general in the Holocaust, in the perpetration of the Holocaust. Many historians attempt to prove guilt or uninvolvement of these subjects. Others demonstrate a complex palette of motives and complicity in this genocide. The first question that I would like to put to the panel is, what approaches do you think we ought to use to transcend the discourse of national guilt or national innocence, and think and consider the entire complexity of the events of the Second World War and the Holocaust? That is the first question that I would like to suggest that we open our discussion with today. I will begin with introducing our discussants. We have with us today Karel Berkov, a leading scholar at the Netherlands Institute for the Study of the War, Holocaust and Genocide of the Royal Academy of the Netherlands. He teaches at the University of Amsterdam and co-director of the European Infrastructure for the Study of the Holocaust project. Ms. Halinada Hrinchenko, Professor Halinada Hrinchenko of the Kharkiv National University, editor-in-chief of Ukraina Moderna and head of the Ukrainian Association of Oral History. Dieter Pohl, Professor of Modern History of the Alpine Adriatic University, Klagenfurt, member of the advisory board of the military burials, and a member of the Austrian-Ukrainian Commission of Historians. Kai Struve at the Institute for History at the Martin Luther University. I suggest we start the discussion of the questions that presented today. We can be free, whoever's ready to take the floor and state their comment or their opinion of our first question on the first question of our discussion. like I said, it needs to, what approaches do you think we should apply to transcend, to leave the discourse of national guilt or innocence and consider the entire complexity of the events of World War II and the Holocaust? I would like maybe a Ukrainian citizen to start. Perhaps a woman. Thank you, Karol. I hope this was not a setup, because actually I wanted to continue to maybe pick up and continue on thoughts expressed by more experienced members of our panel with more study and more works in their experience. So perhaps I would perhaps ask Dieter Paul to begin, if he agrees. Thank you, Dieter.
Yeah, thank you, Lord. Thank you for inviting me to this very interesting panel on this important event. So I've prepared, I know the question, or I knew the questions in advance, so I've prepared some statement to have more systematic answer on that. So first thing I would emphasize, it's necessary to leave this pattern of national guilt, which is not very historiographical, and it's misleading in a certain way. I have only one exception, and that's the German one. So I think the European Jewry was in first place a German project. It was organized by the German state and by its representative. But it's clear that it was negotiated with several regimes, right-wing regimes, maybe allies, but also collaboration governments like in Vichy and so on. And if we look at the implementation, then we see that it was enacted by a large segment of local non-German institutions and even more individuals. I think there are two exceptions to that rule. In general, the one is Romania, where an almost independent government organized its own program of mass murder in Ukraine in the first place, though also under the umbrella of a German war, the German-Soviet war. And to a certain extent, we can say this about Ustasha, Croatia, which was not so independent as Romania was. I think in first place, it's necessary to pay attention to the power relations in Hitler's Europe. The German occupation regime not only decided all major fields of policy, but also transferred the power to national, regional, and local institutions. The German regime, by and large, formed the discourses, especially in the public sphere, by propaganda, but also in daily life. And it heavily affected social relations under occupation. I think that German violence heavily affected the whole societies by destroying the old social order, by displaying an unknown dimension of violence, especially in place, unlike, for example, Stalinist violence, which was more isolated in remote spaces, and by redistributing in first place property and to a certain extent also workforce. So I would say from 1941, 1942 on, that the German rule, especially in Eastern Europe, demoralized part of the societies. And that's an important frame if we talk about collaboration, individual collaboration, but also institutional collaboration. On the other hand, it's obvious that most European societies had already been infested with anti-Semitism before the war, and that anti-Semites now under German occupation were brought to the forefront. But non-German organizations under occupation had their own agenda, sought to benefit from German hegemony, for example, by aligning to German policies, by exploiting their own Jewish minorities' property, and also to a certain extent to workforce, like Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary. But they were also restricted in their behavior towards the Jews. So they couldn't help the Jews under German rule in a certain way. That's important to know. And there was also a factor which is often overlooked, that there was a lack of social leadership under occupation, especially in Eastern Europe. The leadership was away, it was destroyed by the Germans by and large. So this also contributed to what I would call a moral decline. So the answer to this question for me is to develop a model of power relations, of societal order in cultural discourses under German rule. And then to draw conclusions about responsibilities, to say who was responsible for what, more the Germans or more the national organizations or individuals. And thus national borders and national communities only play a minor role in this concept. It's more the memory which is nationalized now. These are retrospective interpretations for me. And I think it would be useful to compare the German system of rule with other patterns, like the fascist Italian case, the militarist Japanese case, or even the Soviet case, but also with patterns of colonial rule, but in this case, more continental imperialism, like the Russian case, for example, in the 19th century, and less what is being discussed right now, at least in Germany and in the United States, than overseas imperialism. So my argument is we need a concept first to talk about what is called, I think not very appropriately, collaboration in the Holocaust. That's my answer to your question.
Дякуємо, професоре Поль, за вашу
Thank you, Professor Paul, for this extensive contextualizing answer. Colleagues, I would like to ask you to please join the discussion.
Okay.
Professor Berkhoff, yes.
Thank you, Dieter, for that. I totally agree. I also think that it's useful to speak a lot more about all the various sources that we should be using. I happen to be involved with this project called the European Holocaust Research Infrastructure, which has a portal. Anybody can go there. They cannot necessarily see the documents, but they can find out about them. So these days, anyone who wants to study the Holocaust in Ukraine is advised to have a look there and then to really think hard before starting off. What are the sources that I'm going to be needing? And that will require some difficult choices. But the best choices, it seems to me, are choices for a great variety of sources. The days when we could simply use only German language materials or only Ukrainian and Russian language materials, they should be gone by now, but they're not. And in particular, I am thinking of sources that unfortunately take a lot of time to study. And I'm talking here about diaries and in particular audiovisual interviews. These sources require much more study because often they are the only ones that are available, and moreover, they offer multiple perspectives that really break away the simplicity. So this is simply a call for all of us to help newcomers in the field sorting out where they should be starting and helping them once they have made their selections. I'm happy with this forum, and there should be many more of these that would involve junior scholars. So this is my first response.
Yes,
Дякуємо, професоре Беркhoff.
Thank you, Professor Berkhoff. I would like to give the floor to Dr. Struve to continue.
Thank you very much also for inviting me to this conference and for having the possibility to participate in this discussion. Yes, maybe I can add one point to that, what Dieter Pohl and Karl Berkhoff said, and what I think is right and important. but I think we should also have in mind when we discuss the Ukrainian case that here these contradictions and the conflict regarding the question of guilt or innocence, as you posted as you said it in the question, is probably particularly strong and maybe more strong than in other cases. That is also I think rather complex situation of this conflict or contradiction. Because on the one hand, you have in the international public a rather strong image of collaboration and participation in the Holocaust, sometimes or not rarely exaggerated. And on the other hand, you have also in Ukraine or have had or have a rather strong conflicts that is a little bit different than that to what you have in the international public, that is that between the Soviet narrative of the history of World War II and a national narrative. From the beginning, or initially in both narratives, the Jewish case was absent, but since the 1990s and after 2000 played also in this conflict a certain role. And I think the answer to these different problems should be and can be, as also Karl Berghoff and Dieter Pohl said, it to do the answer of the historians to this should be to do concrete research on concrete cases, concrete localities or regions, and try to reconstruct with a broad range of sources, with with different voices and different perspectives, what actually happened and who participated in what and with which motives, etc.
Дякуємо, доктор Штруве.
Thank you, Dr. Struve, for your response. And Professor Helena Dagrinchenko, thank you, colleagues. Thank you, Petra. Thank you, organizers, for inviting me and for giving me the opportunity to participate, the opportunity to focus our attention on what Petro has already mentioned, that we will have a separate, special issue of Ukraina Moderna dedicated to this topic, where we will primarily attempt to attract young scholars that Yaroslav Hesek has already mentioned. We have this first generation of people looking into these subjects, now involved, now with certain results, findings. So the questions we're discussing today are really only part of our forum, the forum that we are opening to our colleagues who have a lot to say on the subjects, or perhaps less. The forum will be broader than the questions we discussed today. And as somebody involved in formulating these questions, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to look at them, to have an outside view of them and participate in that discussion, because as the editor-in-chief of Ukraina Moderna, I will not participate in the forum, and I will only edit and attempt to compile and present this forum in printed form, in published form, to make it both attractive and interesting. As for the first question, how do we transcend this discourse? I think the answer is obvious, and it has to do. It's been basically voiced in the answers that we have heard today. it's a switch from a discourse of national guilt or national history in general, of these macro formulations, to a discourse to the study of the history of the everyday from the perspective of the occupation. So certain frameworks that occupation imposed on everyday life, and those strategies that people used to respond to these changed frameworks, they changed conditions that they hadn't chosen, that they were forced to adapt to every day with varying levels of initiative and desire to adapt. And it is this multifaceted nature of human behavior that can function as the main focus, or that point of view that will help us look at very different human behaviors. Olena Stashkina has mentioned this morning. You know, when you had such a huge spectrum of possible behavioral strategies or simply actions, that in the morning they might have done one thing, and in the evening they might have done a completely different thing. And so it's very difficult then to put people into these very clear, very harsh frameworks that this question supposes. So there's the frame of guilt and frame of, let's say, innocence. But between them, there's a massive range of behaviors and actions or agencies, as we say in the terminology that we now use in English language historiography. So the actions people choose consciously or unconsciously. So I think in order to transcend these very, very rough, rigid categories, we have to look at the everyday of everyday life under occupation, the conditions that people were given or were imposed by the occupation, and then at the strategies, the behavioral reactions that people resorted to, that people employed in order to survive in those absolutely new, absolutely unknown alien conditions. That's the first thing. And then the second aspect, which I will probably switch to the next question, or this will maybe serve as a bridge to the next question, because what sources we can use and how to implement this. Well, I think that many people know what I do. For 20 years now, I've been working with oral history. So direct evidence recorded by me and my colleagues, both from people who have suffered from violence and from those who are there, who know them or who are their ancestors. And also there's the category of I will stop on this, the use of certain categories, but the category of the so-called observers, or simply people who can say something about the development of the Holocaust. So the involvement of oral history testimony, and it's the complex of new oral sources, I think will be very good exit, very good option to leave these, transcend these rigid frameworks and categories. Because human testimony, human emotion, human narrative, that story that is told to the camera is so varied, so multifaceted, that it will provide us with so many perspectives to study that we won't even have the tools to study it, and we'll have to come up with new tools. And this is where I think it's a very promising avenue of exploration to continue and form new tools for the work. Coming back to the start of my introduction, we will work with the everyday of the Holocaust, the everyday of what the war brought as an extraordinary situation. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Hrinchenko. And to continue our discussion, a question we also included in our forum, it has to do with sources, the question of sources. The discussions continue today in Ukraine on the importance of oral historical sources. Some recognize them, some criticize them for being too subjective. But the most recent studies dedicated to the events in Meropil, the ravine by Babyn Yar, demonstrate that the documents can be unreliable, even extremely so. So, in connection to this, our next question has to do with sources. Historians have long focused on documents and positivist approaches to the events of the past, which means that we have to move to the study of the evidential of eyewitness testimony. Now, how did this tendency, how did this shift away from the shift towards eyewitness testimony mark the studies of the Holocaust? But I'll probably continue because this is where I finished my presentation. Perhaps the colleagues can have a think about what they can say about this. Well, as far as oral sources, yes, it's a source like any other source, to the same extent. It is also unreliable, subjective. All sources are subjective and unreliable. And we have only one objective given, it's death in our life. Everything else is unreliable and subjective. So this is what makes historical testimony good or interesting. There is also quite a lot of literature here about this. It's the same metaphor that's already been used today. We can wrap it around the equator. Lots of ink has been spilled on this, on the subjectivity, on the positive aspects of subjectivity. Because subjectivity is not just mine or yours. It is also formed by collective experiences, the rootedness in a certain culture, whatever cliches or stereotypes used by the official discourse. All this is very interesting. But what I wanted to stress here is that Ukrainian historiography hasn't reflected upon two aspects. Firstly, we haven't reflected on the categoriality that I started at the beginning. We use the categories of victim, eyewitness, observer, ancestor. I would like to use the victim as an example. The English language historiography has now a number of works that give examples of answers and responses of the people titled as victims. In several works, we've seen the phrase that say, "I am not a victim. I have other experience in my life." There is even an article called I'm not a survivor. Yes, I survived the Holocaust, but please don't call me a victim. Don't call me by this category. I'm not a category, I'm a person. And that is a very important question of our attitude and our naming, our terming of those people that we question and whose stories we introduce into scholarly circulation. I would like to exhort us against using such usage. I've looked at works that I've attempted to write and the names I've tried to give even to my projects that I submitted. I also had this usage of victim or survivor. And after I read these works written after the responses of people who do not want to be termed such, don't want to be termed victims, I have other experience as well. And this is, by the way, this is very interesting because this problem was first looked at by an author who was spoken to a child, and the child says, "Well, this person you're writing about, what are their hobbies?" And I think, yes, it's this childish immediacy, this completely different view of the world, right? As we remember with Mark Bloch and the response, it's the same thing. The person who's looking at oral research, it was the same response to this childish question. I mean, yes, I never asked the question to the victim. Well, what are your hobbies? What are your interests? What is your life like? What is important to you apart from that experience that you once experienced? Even though that experience is very important, even though we respect and empathize with that experience. This is my first thesis. So there's a certain, we should be careful with operating the categories that we introduce, that we impose, that we use, and that we use to label these people and their story. Perhaps we should be more careful, more empathetic, and more open to different interpretations. And another thesis that's very briefly, another thing that isn't being discussed here, I mean, the English language and the German language, the historiographer has already started looking at this, but we haven't. It's the role of the scholar in the forming of the oral testimony. So that half, not even half, that, but that part of responsibility that we carry as scholars when we form a particular oral testimony, starting with our questions and concluding with our emotions, our attitudes to our narrators. And perhaps the most ignored question in Ukrainian historiography, the most neglected one, is the influence of this tragedy, on us. You know, how hard it is for us to sleep, to breathe, to live after this, and how we ourselves have to live with this after we find out the number of subjective tragedies. It's very, very difficult, and it's very important to discuss this as well and to involve this in the study, in the operation of the use of particular terms in the study of the experience of the Holocaust. Thank you. Thank you, Helenada. I would like to give the floor to our other discussants. Professor Berkov, yes.
Yeah, thank you for those comments. And of course, I forgot to say at the beginning, I'm also grateful for the invitation to be here. The notion that certain categories of people are not useful is important, and it has existed also for concepts such as perpetrator. We now realize in genocide studies more and more that it's more useful to speak as researchers, maybe not as educators, I'll get to that, but as researchers, it's perhaps more useful to speak of perpetration, the phenomenon, the acts, because the next day that same person might actually save one single person, among other things. So this is something that as a method of researching is actually very useful. I'm not entirely sure myself if once we present our findings, it is the best strategy to say, well, everybody did lots of things. You know, ultimately, our audience are people who are smart, but they also want a clear message once in a while. And there's a lot of impatience out there for nuances. And I don't agree, but that's the fact. So we need to be a little bit careful. So I'd like to propose that as a working method, it's very useful. But then once you make the step toward presenting your findings, you have to think again if it would actually produce the outcome that you'd like. Of course, you have only a limited influence on how people are going to read and take in your findings, but nevertheless, it's important to realize that, once again, I repeat myself, people are not often that patient enough as we are because we are studying this all the time. Now, a second point is I'm happy with the increased availability of transcripts. I've worked with audiovisual interviews, and I'm glad to mention, for instance, that Kelinada shared a few with me, and that's so great because we all know that when we look at these interviews, the time that it takes is not wasted, but it's a lot of time. And, you know, in the past, I think the Shoah Foundation was rather hesitant in making transcripts available. The notion seems to have been, once we have the written texts, nobody's going to look at the videos again. I think that fear, if it was actually out there, it was a mistake. And I think by now we're seeing more and more transcripts which are absolutely essential for anybody who wants to study a lot of interviews. It's just not possible to spend hours and hours afraid you miss a detail. With a transcript, you can actually go back and check. And then, of course, there might be some mistakes, but at least it's a general basis, much better than an abstract. So that's a very practical comment.
Дякуємо. Доктора Штруve.
Thank you, Dr. Struve. Dr. Struve, the floor is yours.
Yes, yes, I think I never understood this concept that only the kind of official sources, German documents, or maybe documents of some Ukrainian institutions in the period of the occupation are those sources we have to rely upon, because every source has its perspective, its limitation, and you can only. And as a historian, you need as many sources and as many different perspectives, sources of different kinds, in order to be able to reach to good conclusions, or to conclusions that have a solid base. And I think that is even more important for the subject of the Holocaust in Ukraine, but because for many, at least for many smaller localities, you have only a very limited amount of sources, and often you don't have any German or other official documents. So you need all other sources, and I think from practical research, it's quite clear that you can't do it without testimonies that have originated from different people in different circumstances. May it be testimonies of Jews that had been given at different times, often directly after the war, or testimonies from judicial inquiries also in Soviet times, or also for the perpetrators or other groups of perpetrators in German judicial inquiries, and that are very important and basic sources. Maybe one more remark on this question of categories, how we use categories and what do they mean. I believe that we can't operate and argue and develop our narratives without using concepts like perpetrators or victims. However, that needs to be done or one needs to be conscious and needs to be clear about it, that are not fixed categories for persons, but that these are categories that belong to certain situations. I mean, you have this very strongly or controversially discussed case of Ukrainian police units also participating in this or supporting the German police units in the Babyn Yar massacre, originally established by some nationalist forces, and at the same time some of these people later have been shot at the same place as the Jewish victims before, or maybe have been shot at the same place, maybe also a question of controversy, but so you have perpetrators that later become victims, and such things have to be considered.
Дуже дякуємо, доктор Штруve.
Thank you, Dr. Struve. Professor Paul, yes, the floor is yours.
Yes, I want to continue a little bit on this terminology question. I fully agree with Karel. We have to use some terms. I mean, we should discuss, for example, the term collaboration, which is abundantly used, especially in the post-Soviet sphere. And it's a highly problematic term, I have to say. It's especially if you look, for example, at the new publications on Poland and so on, where you have resistors against the German regime who kill Jews. So what do you do with them and so on? I would say two things about the victims perpetrators issue. The one thing is these are terms which have to be historicized. The whole victim terminology is something quite new. We have this since the 1980s, and if you look into the literature and Western literature before that, you probably won't find the terms victims and perpetrators. One reason is because the victim terminology is part of a bigger discourse of national identities, and I would call this the victimization of historical identity. And you see it in the 50s, 60s, everybody was speaking about heroism, resistance, and how to behave properly under occupation. Nobody wanted to be a victim, and it was a bad term in a certain sense. And then from the 1980s, this victimization discourse started. For example, the most visible case where you see that is China. When the Chinese talked publicly about the Japanese occupation, they always talked about the heroism of the Communist Party until the 1980s. Since then, the Communist Party switched the whole thing and said, we are the victims of Japanese occupation. Millions were killed. And one of the reasons was because they wanted to blame the Japanese and in order to have advantages on the global market. And so on. So you see this is a highly a term which has to be historical. The perpetrator term is predominantly used in Germany. It's from German judicial language, Täter. This was never used in historiography before the 1980s. You won't find it. And it's new, and only Hilberg, who is of Austrian origin, took it over to the States, and since then it's not very popular, I think, in the United States. That's the one thing. The second thing is both of these terms are relational. We should talk about victims of Holocaust, perpetrators of Holocaust, of this and that crime. Then we can say later on he's a victim of Allied bombing if an SS officer was bombed in when he was on leave at home. There are such cases. It's always relational, and we should say that if it's possible. I mean, it shouldn't be too complicated. I also want to address the term Jew. I mean, a Jew was somebody who was considered by the Germans or their collaborators as a Jew. Maybe he didn't feel as a Jew. I mean, in the Soviet Union, there were lots of atheist Jews, and in more Western societies, I would say about 15 to 20% were not Jewish, but persecuted because their ancestors were Jewish. They were Catholics. You know, there was a Catholic church in the Warsaw Ghetto, and there were 1,500 Catholics in the Warsaw Ghetto as Jews confined. So there is a lot to be discussed here, but as Karel said, we also have a task to educate, but as I would say as a historian, more to synthesize, to find explanations, bigger theses, hypotheses, and then we need these terms. And I think also collaboration cannot be replaced. Now I come to the question of the sources. I think it's really problematic to juxtapose or confront German documentation to eyewitness accounts. The historical research always depends on meaningful research questions and not on the preference of specific sources. And if you look at Holocaust historiography on the long run, of course, the first historians, they wanted to ask the big questions. Why did the Germans do that? Why did Hitler and the German state do it? They have to read German documents. If you stop reading German documents, you won't find out why the Holocaust came. And this is probably the most important question about Holocaust historiography. Why did it happen? And it was about anti-Semitism taken over by a state and disseminated more or less and implemented widely. And it's quite natural that the process of research goes from, let's say, from the global, from the big one to the small one. And now we are on a micro level. And then the micro level, as everybody knows, the German documents won't help you that much. if you look at the perpetrator side, you need these judicial investigations in West Germany, especially in the 60s and 70s, where the perpetrators and their colleagues were interviewed. And of course, we have, I think right now, around 160,000 so-called survivor statements right now, if you look at the Holocaust. If you are going into detail, want to see what's going on the micro level, you cannot avoid it. And of course, you have in both cases real big methodological problems. It's problems of contextualization. How did it come to that interview? When was that interview taken, and so on and so forth. That's quite clear, and everybody knows. But I wouldn't set up this dichotomy of here the German administrative sources, they're the eyewitness sources, because in some of the conferences also there's a tendency to say the eyewitness sources, the Jewish eyewitness sources, have more value than German, because that's a kind of moral connotation. But I think the Holocaust historians are part of general historiography, and they have to apply general methods. There is no specific methodology of Holocaust historiography. At least I can't see any. We have to take the sources and use them critical as we are. And finally, I want to address, a general tendency, and I'm playing a little bit the advocatus diaboli here. Sorry to do that. But I think in Holocaust historiography, it's a big problem to look only at the micro level. We have one of the biggest processes in European history. The same happens more or less in the North Caucasus, but also on the occupied British islands. The German policy trying to exterminate all the Jews, this is a highly centralized issue, and you cannot put apart this big process with all this European-wide and maybe global implications and what is happening in a Ukrainian village. We always have to keep that in mind. And that's also my criticism about Omar Bartov's book. It's a really impressive book, which really shows us what happens. It's gruesome what happens on the micro level. But is it the explanation of the Holocaust? Omar is always telling me when it was a communal Holocaust. And I say I'm not convinced. I say it's a big project which affected the communities and was pretty violent in Eastern Europe with lots of local participation, and a little bit less in Western Europe. And that's why we need comparison all over. Why did the Danish behavior and the Albanians behave different? For example, the totally different circumstances, of course, different context. But we have always, even if we talk about the individual persecuted, we have to keep in mind it's part of a giant crime and of a big historical process. And I voiced this criticism in the last Lessons and Legacies conference in Munich, and I was heavily attacked. So as if I'm against micro studies, but I think it's important to have regulated micro studies to know what's happening somewhere else. And so, because we have to talk about patterns, it won't leave historiography in the long run nowhere if we know what happens in each village. We have to know about patterns, about context. Why did people act so? Of course, out of human motives, but there are patterns all over Europe. Some helped, some robbed, some killed, and so on and so. And why did they do it? And then we have to check the whole context. And that's why it's so important to have always the big process in mind if you talk about the small process. And that's important in the big process. Unfortunately, I have to admit, you only can do research about it if you know the documents, not only German documents, of course, Romanian documents. There are much more Romanian documents on the Holocaust, like Germans and so on. So I think that's very important from a conceptual point of view. And if we want to talk about the Holocaust, for example, on a national level, on Ukraine, which is in a certain sense necessary because you have school books and things like that. But then you have to know the complete thing in order to analyze the specific thing. Thank you.
Дуже дякую, професор Поль. Дуже дякую усім за надзвичайно цікаві відповіді на це запитання.
Thank you, Professor Paul. Thank you, everybody, for these very interesting answers. To continue the questions of identity that we raised in discussing this question, we move on to gender aspects, to how the gender studies, gender history of the Holocaust should be. We have much progress of gender studies in Ukraine and in the world today, and how would this apply to Holocaust studies, the history of the Holocaust and the gender dimension? Please. Professor Barkov, yes.
Well, I'm all in favor. For too long, researchers have omitted to look at possible differences in the way women and men experience the Holocaust. And by now, it's fortunately becoming more natural to have this look. And that means often very basically not overlooking testimonies from women. And also, I'm talking here about German women. It's interesting to read, to say the least, these women who worked at the SS in Kiev and typed away as the interrogation records were made or produced the records. And they sometimes say things that the men omit. You know, I could hear the sounds of the torture below me. I mean, these kinds of details come sometimes from the most unexpected quarters, including female staff who, of course, as we know, were not sent out to Babyn Yar to murder, but they heard the stories and they have their own history. And the same goes for Jewish women. We have much more studies now, and they definitely have often their own trajectories as they try to survive. And in another way of putting it, we also need a lot more female historians who, of course, are not naturally inclined to study women, but in a way, sometimes it's a little easier for them. So we need to bring in many more of them and engage in a dialogue about the various ways in which women were involved in the Holocaust. But overall, I'm happy with this development, and I think so far a lot of the impulses come from abroad. I mean, Wendy Lauer is of course well known, and that's all good. We need a little bit more of that.
Дякуємо, професора Берков.
Thank you, Professor Barkov. To continue the discussion, I would like to invite our discussants today, to our participants to continue the discussion. Professor Paul and then Dr. Struve.
So I was a little bit faster than Kai was, sorry. I think I want to start with a very basic statement everybody knows probably, but I have to reiterate it. We have to distinguish between gender studies and women's history. I mean, what we are talking about most of the time is the history of women as perpetrators, as victims, as bystanders, observers, and whatever. And of course, this has been neglected for a long time, and it's only, I would say, the last 10 years that this really comes into mind. In first place, I have to say, the Nazis wanted to kill men and women, so there is no difference about that. Of course, your experiences were quite different, and it's important to see that also within the policies, there are differences. And that's quite clear that the Nazis killed more women than men during the process. that has to do with a choice for forced laborers, and the forced laborers were in first place taken among men, except, for example, ghettos with textile industry like Białystok or Łódź, where you have more women. And you see it, for example, Warsaw, you have the deportation statistics for the so-called Great Action in July to September 1942, where it's much more women, and the women were almost exterminated during this this action. And for example, if you look at the women in the concentration camps, that's not those who were exterminated in the gas chambers, but those who became inmates. The women's had a higher chance to survive in concentration camps. We know that from concentration camp history. That's one thing which is important and which should be investigated. There are really wonderful studies, not so much about women as perpetrators, though there are some good studies, and women are more perpetrators in other crimes. You shouldn't forget that. For example, in the euthanasia, what it's called killing of mentally ill, there are much more women involved, and they have power. They have much more powers. Positions, for example, in Germany and Austria, they could decide on killings. The nurses could decide on killings. That's quite different in the Holocaust. There are only some exceptions, like Gertrud Slotke in Amsterdam, who rose to a Jewish desk referent in Amsterdam. Karel probably knows more than me. And there are, I also want to relate to the new studies on women among the Arrow Cross. There's about Andrea Pöte, the new book, and there is some study on Ustasha women, which are very interesting. They had their own camp, Jastebasko, for example. And there are lots of micro studies, I would call them, on Jewish women, but not, I would say, a lack of structural approach to this problem. The second thing I want to address is gender history, and that's a little bit different. That's about the cultural discourse on women, both German, which is not so important, but also Jewish women. So how were they perceived, and why were they killed first? So what did the Germans think about Jewish women, for example? And these are typical classical anti-Semitic stereotypes which come up here and have effect here. And also on the other side, what's the role of the female among the persecuted inside the families, for example? In the Soviet Union during the first 2 or 3 months, the men were killed in first place before the Germans switched their policies in late 1941. And so what did it mean for the families? So the Jewish mother more or less became even more important than she was before. So we have to look at the discourses on gender in the Holocaust. And also, for example, you see it among the partisans. That's a very important issue if you're looking into gender history, because women were often not, Jewish women were often not accepted by partisan groups, or the other way around. When the Germans captured Red Army soldiers, there were some Jewish women among them, and we know only very few about it. And there was this specific perception of the Jewish female commissar, the German Flintenweib. For example, this is from the Civil War in 1919, 1920, when the Bolshevik woman was the worst of all. She's a mixture of prostitute and killer, more or less. And this perception prolonged into the Second World War. So I think it's necessary to look into both the history of women on the one side and the gender discourses on the other side, and what role they played in all perspectives of Holocaust history. But I think this is has been started, and it's on a good way, and we will see lots of new and interesting research also during this conference. Thank you.
Дякуємо, професора Полі, доктора Штола.
Thank you, Professor Paul. And Dr. Struve, the floor is yours.
I have only a very general remark on this issue, that is that obviously that also Holocaust studies are not a separate field from more general historical trends and also trends developments in society, and obviously this question of or the methods and approaches of gender studies have been developed before they have been adopted in Holocaust research, also in other fields of historiography, and are now very, I think, successfully also applied in Holocaust research. And I think that can be an incentive or a hint for also for Holocaust historians to observe what methodological developments are going on in other fields of historiography, and also to look to which extent they may enrich their own methods or approaches to their field of research.
Дякую, професор Погрінченко. Прошу вас.
Thank you, Professor Rinchenko. The floor is yours. Yes, thank you. I see that Karl Barkov has something to say, but I only have a brief remark. It is in two parts. So the first part is, yes, I agree with what Dieter Paul said about the separation and being conscious between gender approach and women's history. So yes, there is a tendency of mixing in contemporary Ukrainian historiography, and probably it's a response to kind of the fact that these are fashionable approaches, but so there is the fashionability of the approaches, but not enough understanding of the difference of these approaches. And yes, this is truly a flaw, and in order to differentiate, we have to talk about, yes, well, what do we say about the specificity of the women's experience, and what do we say about the gender approach that we see as particular cultural attitudes that form a certain response from society. And another thing I wanted to add, that it's also very important to employ this approach to analyze the actions and counteractions of those who were perpetrated and those who were the perpetrators. And here, what is very important is that comparative approach that Dieter Paul stressed, because the example that he brought, that women, nurses or junior medical staff who made those decisions about euthanasia, was characteristic only in Germany. As far as I know, the medical personnel also had the opportunity to avoid being involved in the execution. You could come up and say, oh, you're pregnant, or due to certain conditions you don't want to participate in execution. But they had no such opportunity in the Soviet medical personnel, who was forced to give the lethal injections or to participate in the persecution of particular groups of victims. Primarily, of course, I'm talking about the mentally ill. So the gender approach, yes, the difference between the gender, yes, the difference and the comparative nature, all these are very important. I would really like to, maybe in the future, it would be nice to see comparative studies of how the conditions of forced persecution were implemented in different countries and in different cultural circumstances. This would be very important and very fruitful for us to approach the point, the sense, the understanding of this genocide. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Barkov.
Just two brief comments. One is that if you really want to be extremely topical, the best approach is to actually almost step away a little from the distinction between men and women. I mean, these days, certainly in the West, if it even still exists, what people are talking about is that there are persons who do not easily fit in the two categories. but maybe that's a little bit going too far in the Ukrainian context. My suggestion is to be on the watch out for people who are in same-sex relationships. So we're talking not about heterosexuals, but males who are involved with men and women who are involved with women. Let's not forget that category, which sometimes appears in the sources. And again, the question becomes interesting then, how did they experience the Holocaust? And for Ukraine, we have almost zero knowledge on this matter. How people who are attracted to those of their own gender, if we put it this way, either survived or died. And secondly, I'd like to make the case for the study of age groups. I am myself increasingly interested in what maybe we could call generations, although again, that's perhaps not a useful term, but let's just be more basic and say, what do we even know of those people who were born before the revolution as they experienced the Holocaust? Is it possible to study age cohorts? And what does that mean for our thinking about the Holocaust? I think I would love to read a book about testimonies, if only testimonies, of people who were born in the 1890s or just before the revolution. Wouldn't that be fascinating to see if something comes out of that? So then I'm not talking about gender differences anymore, but about people born in a certain time.
Дякуємо, професор Барков, за дуже важливу
Thank you, Professor Barkov, for this very important remark on the fact that the gender dimensions are also the study of not just men and women in their history, but also other groups of victims, including the LGBT community, that of course continued to be discriminated for a long time after the Second World War concluded. To conclude our discussion today, I would offer a question from the memory discourse. How would you comment on the commemoration of the victims in today's Ukraine? And to what extent do the discussions of commemoration affect historiography and history? What should a proper commemoration agenda look like in our country, in Ukraine? What should it look like? Professor Paul, yes.
Yeah, first thing I would start with that historiography is a part of memory. You cannot distinguish those two. You cannot say we are historians, we are on the objective side, the other things are cultural discourses. We are included in these cultural discourses. I see the difference is more in the methodological and conceptual requirements that historiography has, which is different from what public discourse requires. But for example, the terms, as I said, these are highly influenced by cultural discourses, victimization and so on, and what's going on. And I would say, again, a bad remark maybe on Karel, the notion of queer Holocaust, which came up during the last years, is also, of course, a societal discourse which came up. And you probably know we have a new discourse on post-colonial Holocaust or post-colonial perspective on the Holocaust, which is, to put it simply, is highly influenced by the Black Lives Matter movement and so on and so forth. So you cannot actually say we are on a different planet. We are included in a memorial culture, but we have to try to objectivize in a certain way, and thus maybe, but that's very optimistic, to influence memory culture, at least if it's going in a very wrong direction. I mean, the specific case in Ukraine is that there was no Holocaust, or at least no official Holocaust memorialization for a long time. Elinada has shown in a very nice article that there was some memorialization of the different victim groups right after the war in 44, 45. 46. There's this fictional film about Babyn Yar, for example, but this is stopped in 47, 48 with the anti-cosmopolitanism campaign. And then we have silence for almost 40 years. Of course, this applies in first place for the official discourse. And this is the important discourse in the Soviet Union on the union-wide, republic-wide, maybe oblast-wide debate. Of course, there was a different discourse on the basis, like we see in Babyn Yar, memorialization efforts, or Yevtushenko and so on and so forth. But this whole situation differs from what happens in other European countries, even under communist rule. You don't have this in Poland, in Hungary, in Yugoslavia, and so on and so forth. It was possible to publish about the Holocaust, but only on the periphery. It was not at the center of memorialization. That's quite clear. Now the situation is quite different. Since the late 80s, it is possible to memorialize the Holocaust, but certain other problems came up. And in my mind, the biggest problem or the biggest context for that is, of course, Ukrainian nation building since 1991. And especially the nationalization of history and the search for traditions and new heroes, especially nationalist heroes. And of course, there's a conflict between these two tendencies to memorialize the Holocaust and to memorialize own UPA, especially since most of the Holocaust took place in those areas where the own UPA was very active. That's Western Ukraine, by and large. In Galicia and Volhynia, about 700,000 Jews were killed, all in all. And Omar Bartov has written a very polemical book about that. Yaroslav has criticized that, but it's not completely untrue. I mean, if you go to a place where a former ghetto was and you find an UPA memorial in this place, that's a big problem. But my interpretation is that it's a long process of a proper memorialization, and it's a question of discussion. So you cannot say we have now reached the level of a proper memorialization. That's what the Germans think about themselves probably, but they don't have any criteria to say now we have sufficient memorialization or not. I think it's necessary to memorialize all victims of mass murder, of crimes, of mass crimes in a certain way. And the Holocaust is a very specific case, so even more so. And what I wish to see is, of course, a proper memorial in Kiev, and both current projects are more or less horrible, I think. Both the imported one and the homegrown one is, if you read the concept, it's even worse than the Krzyżanowski circus or theater, which is going to be set up. But I also would like to see a Jewish museum in Lviv. I don't know about whether there are plans for that. One of the biggest Jewish communities and much more victims than Kiev. That's important. Maybe in some other bigger cities, except Dnipro, of course. So that's a long process. And if we look at us West Germans, it was also a long process, you have to say, and Germany was in a much more, or in a much better position. West Germany was pretty wealthy, and it was protected by military allies. It was a member of the NATO, so it was highly secure. And in this environment, you can develop a different memory culture than what the situation in Ukraine is. Thank you.
Дякуємо, професоре Поль.
Thank you, Professor Paul. Dr. Struve, yes.
Yes, I would like to add there 2 or 3 points, perhaps. I think it's quite obvious that in Ukraine in the last 15 years or so, the interest in the history of the Holocaust has grown strongly and beyond the Jewish community. I think when you look what happened in the 1990s and also perhaps in the first decade of after the turn of the century, that was largely a kind of reconstruction of suppressed Jewish memory in the Soviet period. But since then, you see also that there is a rising, increasing interest also in other parts of society. How this commemoration should look like, I think that's not a question for me or for us, but that's a question that the Ukrainian society has to decide. But I would maybe there are 2 points that from my perspective may be important to have in mind. On the one hand, I think commemoration cannot be restricted or should not be restricted to the Holocaust itself. But I think it's especially for the small towns or medium or smaller cities in many parts of Ukraine, especially in Western Ukraine, it's would also be important to have a kind of commemoration, representation, and memory of the multi-ethnic past of the whole region and of the specific localities, and not restricted to the period of World War II, but also to the previous centuries. The other somewhat different point is, and I think Dieter Pohl has already pointed a little bit towards this issue, is the question what relation the Holocaust or how the Holocaust should be commemorated in relation to other mass crimes. We have now in Germany a discussion about the commemoration of the relation between the commemoration of the Holocaust and that of colonial crimes. I think the much more urgent and the extremely especially for the Ukrainian society, urgent question is that of the relation of the commemoration of the Holocaust in relation to Soviet crimes, and that is an issue that I, as an outside observer, I encounter nearly in every discussion that you have in Ukraine about Holocaust commemoration. And I think that is an important and legitimate question, and comes from the experience of also massive Soviet crimes in this society. Thank you.
Дякуємо, доктора Штруve.
Thank you, Dr. Struve.
Професора Берков.
Professor Barkov, yes, the floor is yours.
I'm actually utterly amazed by the Ukrainian state leadership, because I just don't understand why there is so little interest in that circle in actually becoming a bit more professional in commemorating the Holocaust. I'm just thinking about the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. Many countries are a member. Russia's not, Ukraine is not, it's not even an observer. And I just don't understand what is behind that. Is it simply a sense that we can do it ourselves? Probably not, but I'm just guessing here. If Ukraine would become an observer or a liaison country or even a member, that would make things so much easier. You could then engage in a dialogue with fellow leaders, what works for you, what doesn't work, and feel less alone, I guess. And that's a forum where experts actually engage in a dialogue with leaders as well. So in my opinion, it's a pretty successful forum. And I'm just asking the Ukrainians here, is there any chance that this might happen, that Ukraine would become a part of that network? Because that would really push the memory in a, well, let's call it a more professional or well thought out direction. And as a foreigner, I totally agree with what Kai said. You have to be careful. It's something for Ukrainian society, but yes, Ukrainian society, but I'm also thinking of the Ukrainian state. Not all the answers must come from there. I see that, but so far I see too little from the state, and I just don't. I'd like to hear your view on what is the reason.
Дякуємо, професоре Берков. І професорка Гринченко. Вам слово.
Дякую дуже, Петре, дякую всім, хто...
Thank you, Professor Barkov, Professor Zhenko. Yes, thank you, Petra. We have this interesting situation that the question of commemoration is more difficult than the question of the study of what the Holocaust was, both in Europe and both in Europe in general and the Ukrainian lands in particular. Overall, I adhere to this kind of a multi-voice approach. It's best to preclude the existence of a single narrative, a single strategy. I prefer the micro approach to the study of any component in the historical past. So my stance here is such that commemoration as such, which is the process of commemorating and recreating certain memories of the past in the present, that it ought more generally be based on local initiatives, on the local way of remembering that arose almost immediately after the tragedy happened. Also in Ukraine, there's a number of studies that look at the local initiatives of commemorating the memory of the tragedy, marking the tragedy. Before, we're talking about understanding the scale of the tragedy, but we were commemorating those who had died somewhere in the vicinity, so that people you knew personally. So I think in order to build any kind of national strategy for commemoration, it seems to me that we ought to first focus on the experience of these small local initiatives, and that would show us a lot on how to talk about this, how to commemorate this, and how to carry this knowledge into the future. And then we can put the question, maybe not to the separate groups in society, but to the state. That is my sort of brief remark. And I would also like to maybe have other participants of the Ukrainian side to participate in discussion, because I don't feel it doesn't feel apt for me to speak on behalf of everyone. This is just my opinion, and that is based on this local diversity of voices. I think that we should study that, recreate that, and use that as our starting point. Thank you, Professor Hrinchenko. Thank you, everyone who participated today in our discussion, for this their very interesting opinions, for their global contextualized, conceptualized answers to the questions we raised. Our discussion is approaching the end today, but our colloquium continues tomorrow. The program is online. We are adhering to that program. Tomorrow we continue at 10 with the participation of young Ukrainian scholars, and we'll continue our colloquium on the history of the Holocaust in the lands of occupied Ukraine, the territories of occupied Ukraine. Thank you all for the discussion. The recording will be available in both languages. It will be posted on the websites of all the partner initiatives and organizations. And Konstantin Zihov requested the floor. Yes. So the key word today was testimony, right? And the multiplicity of voices. And I would like to, maybe in the end, it would be nice to see the faces of those who participated in our discussion. This seems important to us, that we all have a nice screenshot of this very important meeting. And I also would like to say that because we were talking about women's voices and the importance of women's voices, And we have a women's voice from France, from Paris, from Irina Dmitryshin. Perhaps Irina would like to say a few words in conclusion. Yes, thank you. Pani Irina, the floor is yours. Now again, I would like to use this opportunity to repeat that we're implementing this project with French partners. We have French partners as well, the Institute for Eastern Languages and Civilizations. I give the floor to Ms. Irina Dmitryshin, chair of the Ukrainian studies of that institute.
Дуже дякую, шановні колеги. Я надзвичайно рада, що ця конференція, цей колоквіум відбувається саме в ці дні. Я думаю, це надзвичайно важлива справа. Я під враженням від тих питань, які вже були підняті сьогодні протягом цієї дискусії щодо термінології і щодо вивчення як Голокосту, так і його комеморації. І я би, можливо, завершила на тому, що вже було згадано про наближення до розуміння. І мені здається, це одне з найважливіших таких понять, що те, що ми робимо сьогодні, це ж одна з тих підвалин, які нам допоможуть наблизитися до розуміння того, що сталося, що нам з цим треба робити і як нам треба далі з цим жити. І очевидно, що завтра ще теж буде насичений великий день, і я бажаю всім завтра дуже мати можливість бути на всіх панелях, і я вже в очікуванні тих важливих дискусій, питань, які будуть підняті протягом завтрашнього дня, завдяки, перш за все, хорошій організації і хорошому компонуванню, скажімо так, багатому компонуванню цих 2 днів і цієї зустрічі. Так що дякую організаторам.
Дуже дякуємо, пані Ірино. Отож, до зустрічі завтра. Приєднуйтесь до нашого колоквіуму о 10:00, ще раз нагадаю. Всім гарного вечора.